Margaret had always been the backbone of her family. For as long as she could remember, her life had been dedicated to the care and well-being of those she loved. She spent her younger years raising her children, ensuring they were fed, clothed, and educated. She made every sacrifice to make sure they had what they needed, often at the cost of her own needs and desires. She was a mother, a wife, a caregiver. Her role was clear, and she embraced it fully. But over time, things changed. Her children grew up, moved away, and started their own lives. Her husband, John, who had always been by her side, began to slow down as well. He retired, and their home, once filled with the laughter of children and the busyness of life, grew quiet. Margaret found herself with more time on her hands, but not necessarily more purpose. Despite this, she continued to pour herself into her family, believing that was what she was meant to do. Her husband, John, had been diagnosed with cancer a few years earlier, and though he was in remission, his health was still fragile. Margaret took care of him, always there to provide comfort and support, always giving more than she ever took for herself. She found fulfillment in making sure others were okay, even if she wasn't entirely sure if she was. But then, something changed, a shift that Margaret never saw coming. One day, she overheard a conversation between her children. It was casual at first, just a conversation about plans for the holidays. But then one of them mentioned her. "Mom is such a freeloader," they said, laughing lightly. "She just sits around waiting for us to help her. She never does anything for herself." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. She froze. Was this how they saw her? After everything she had done for them, this was what they thought of her. She had spent her entire life giving love, giving time, giving energy, and this was the gratitude she received in return. The truth stung. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was the confirmation of a deep-seated fear Margaret had harbored for years. She had always felt like she was invisible in her own family. But now this wasn't just about being unnoticed. It was about being dismissed, unappreciated, and labeled as a burden. The very children she had given everything to were now calling her a freeloader. The realization was devastating. Margaret sat in silence for hours after hearing those words, struggling to comprehend how she could have been so blind to the growing distance between her and her family. Her heart ached, and for the first time in a long while, she wondered whether all her sacrifices had been worth it. But instead of letting the pain consume her, Margaret decided that this was the moment she would change everything. She would no longer let herself be the one who gave endlessly without receiving. She would stop waiting for others to recognize her worth. This was the start of a new chapter, a chapter where she would reclaim her life and take control of her own future. The days following that moment of realization were filled with turmoil. Margaret was torn between hurt and anger, but also a newfound sense of determination. For years, she had defined herself by what others needed, constantly living in the shadows of her family's expectations. But now, she was ready to step into the light on her own terms. That evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, Margaret sat in the living room, staring at the old family photos on the wall. Memories of her children's childhood filled her mind. The birthday parties, the late-night study sessions, the holidays where they'd all gather around the dinner table. These were the moments she had cherished, moments she thought would last forever. But now, those memories seemed distant, almost like a different lifetime. And as she looked at her reflection in the glass of the picture frame, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She had spent so many years living for others that she had lost sight of herself. Her dreams, her desires, her passions, they had all been pushed aside to make room for everyone else. The thought of pursuing something for herself felt foreign, almost impossible. But then, as the silence of the evening settled around her, Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. What if it wasn't too late to start over? What if she could carve out a life for herself, independent of the roles she had always played? It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt ready to take that first step towards something new. She had spent so much of her life focused on taking care of others. Now, it was time to take care of herself. The next morning, Margaret woke up with a sense of purpose. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't know exactly what she wanted to do, but she knew she had to make a change. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew it had to be something big, something that would give her a sense of independence and control over her own life. As she sipped her coffee, a thought struck her: real estate. Margaret had always been interested in properties. She remembered the days when she and John used to talk about buying a home together, the dreams they shared of having a place to call their own. But somehow those dreams had faded into the background, replaced by the demands of family life. What if, just maybe, she could invest in a property of her own? Something that didn't just belong to her, but also gave her the chance to build something from the ground up. The idea seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. Could she really do this? Was she capable of managing a property on her own? And more importantly, could she afford it? But as she thought about it more, Margaret realized that this was the chance she had been waiting for. The chance to prove to herself that she was more than just the person everyone relied on. She was capable of standing on her own 2 feet, of making her own decisions, of living a life that was entirely hers. With a sense of determination, Margaret pulled out her laptop and began searching for properties. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly, but something about the process excited her. For the first time in years, she felt in control, and it felt good. That evening, after hours of browsing listings, Margaret found it, a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was old and run down, but there was potential. The building had character, and with a little work, it could be turned into something truly special. Margaret knew that buying the property wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But at that moment, she didn't care. She had made a decision, and it was the first step toward reclaiming her life. She picked up the phone and called the real estate agent. "I'm interested in the building on Maple Street," she said. "I'd like to make an offer." It was a small step, but to Margaret it was everything. She was no longer just the woman who took care of others. She was the woman who was taking control of her own destiny. And as she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ready to face it head on. She had made her choice. It was time to start living for herself. The days following Margaret's decision were a blur of anticipation and excitement. She had made the first bold step towards reclaiming her life, but now came the hard part: making it a reality. The idea of owning property had always seemed like something out of reach for someone like her, but now it was within her grasp. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, a moment that would define the rest of her life. The apartment building on Maple Street was not glamorous by any means. It was an older, modest structure with peeling paint and creaky floors. The tenants weren't exactly the type to send postcards of their fancy new condos. Most of them were hard-working, down-on-their-luck families, just trying to get by. But Margaret saw potential. She saw the possibility for change. With some repairs, a little love, and a lot of hard work, this place could be something more than just a rundown building. She remembered the agent's words when she first walked through the property. "It's not much now, but with a little investment, you could turn it into something special. It has a lot of room for growth." Margaret had seen it too. The layout was simple, the rooms spacious. The location was quiet, nestled on the outskirts of the city, but still close enough to everything. She didn't need a luxury high-rise. She just needed something she could make her own. The idea of owning it, of managing it, was like a dream come true. But there was the matter of the cost. As Margaret sat at the kitchen table, a notebook filled with numbers and calculations in front of her, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The building wasn't cheap, and though she had some savings, she didn't have enough to cover it all. She would need a loan, a big loan. The thought of taking on so much debt was terrifying, but as she stared at the numbers in front of her, she realized she had no choice. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. After spending hours weighing the pros and cons, Margaret took a deep breath and made the call. She reached out to the bank and started the process of applying for the loan. Her heart raced as she provided her financial information, and as the loan officer assured her that everything would be handled, Margaret tried to remain calm. She had to remind herself that this was the path she had chosen. She was no longer a passive participant in her life. She was the one making the decisions now. A week later, Margaret received the news. The bank had approved her loan. The excitement she felt was overwhelming. This was real. She was really going to do this. She could hardly believe it, but the documents were signed and the property was hers. The moment she held the keys in her hand, Margaret felt a rush of emotions, pride, relief, and a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just the woman who had cared for everyone else. She was the woman who had taken control of her future. This was her victory. But as she stepped through the door of the building for the first time as its owner, she realized that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. The building was far from perfect, and it would take time, effort, and money to get it up to her standards. But Margaret was ready. She had faced the fear, taken the leap, and now there was no turning back. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The building was hers, and she was going to make sure it became something extraordinary. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be obstacles along the way. But Margaret was no stranger to hard work. She had spent years giving everything to others. Now it was her turn to build something for herself. As the days passed and the renovations began, Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She wasn't just working on a building, she was working on herself. Each repair, each improvement was a step toward reclaiming her power, her independence, and her identity. This was her journey, and she was going to see it through to the end. And so Margaret's new chapter began, not as a freeloader, but as a woman in control of her own life. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt ready to face it. She had taken the plunge. Now, it was time to build something that was truly hers. Owning the apartment building was just the beginning. As Margaret worked on the renovations and slowly transformed the space, she realized that taking control of her finances and her future wasn't enough. She also needed to take control of her relationships. For years, she had sacrificed her own well-being to take care of others, always putting her family's needs ahead of her own. But now, as she stood in the midst of her new venture, she knew she couldn't afford to continue living this way. Setting boundaries was something Margaret had never been good at. She had always been the one to give, to help, to say yes, even when she felt drained. It was how she had been raised, how she had lived her life, and she thought it was just what a good mother and wife did. But now, with the building under her care and her future on the line, Margaret realized she could no longer afford to let others dictate her choices. She began with small steps. It wasn't easy, and the guilt gnawed at her every time she said no, but she had to start somewhere. Her children, especially, were the hardest to manage. They had grown accustomed to her being at their beck and call, and when they called, they expected her to drop everything to help them. But now, when the phone rang, Margaret found herself hesitating. She had spent years responding to their every need, but now she had needs of her own. She had a business to run, a life to build, and she couldn't afford to waste time on things that didn't align with her new priorities. "I'm sorry, I can't help right now," she would say firmly, even though it pained her to say it. "I have something important to take care of." At first, her children were confused. They couldn't understand why their mother, who had always been there for them, was suddenly so distant. They didn't realize that this wasn't about rejecting them. It was about Margaret rejecting the role of martyr she had worn for so long. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore. She was a woman who had her own life, her own ambitions, and her own needs. The tension between Margaret and her family grew in the beginning, and the guilt of saying no often felt unbearable. But Margaret slowly learned that this wasn't about being selfish. It was about being self-respecting. She had to care for herself in order to be able to care for others. She had to set boundaries to protect her time, her energy, and her mental health. The work on the apartment building demanded her focus, and if she was going to make it a success, she couldn't afford to let anything distract her. It wasn't just her children. Margaret also had to set boundaries with friends and extended family members. She began to notice how often she had allowed others to take advantage of her time, whether it was an old friend asking for a favor or a relative calling to vent about their problems. Margaret had always been the go-to person for everyone else, but now she was learning to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. At first, these boundaries felt unnatural. She felt like she was letting people down, or worse, that they might think she didn't care about them. But over time, she realized that the people who truly mattered would respect her boundaries. And if they didn't, well, Margaret was finally starting to understand that that was their problem, not hers. As the weeks passed, Margaret grew more confident in asserting her boundaries. She realized that this wasn't about being harsh or unkind. It was about taking control of her life and her time. She wasn't asking for permission to live her life the way she wanted. She was claiming her right to do so. The change in Margaret's life was profound. Her stress began to lessen as she no longer felt pulled in 1,000 different directions. She found herself with more time for the things that truly mattered to her, the renovations, her health, and, yes, even a little self-care. She had the space to think, to plan, and to pursue her own goals without feeling guilty for doing so. Her children, at first resistant, began to see the difference in her. They started to respect her decisions, even if they didn't fully understand them. One afternoon, her daughter called, and this time the conversation was different. "Mom," her daughter said, "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I know it's been hard, but you've really turned things around. We can see it." Margaret smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. She hadn't expected praise, but hearing those words from her daughter meant the world to her. It wasn't about validation from others. It was about feeling proud of herself for the first time in years, for taking the steps to protect her well-being, for demanding respect, and for finally living for herself. Setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no to others. It was about saying yes to herself. It was about taking control, protecting her time and energy, and honoring her own worth. Margaret realized that in setting these boundaries, she was not just creating a healthier relationship with herself, but also with those around her. And in the end, that made all the difference. Now, as she continued to manage the building, Margaret felt a sense of balance she had never known before. The hard work of renovations was still there, but now it felt like a labor of love. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a life. And this time, it was one that was entirely her own. Owning the building wasn't the fairy tale Margaret had imagined. While the excitement of having something she could truly call her own was thrilling, the reality of managing the property soon settled in. Margaret quickly learned that property ownership was a constant juggling act of responsibilities, unexpected challenges, and financial strain. The first few weeks were filled with repairs. There were leaky pipes, broken windows, and electrical issues that seemed to pop up at the most inconvenient times. Each time Margaret thought she had one problem under control, another would arise, and it was overwhelming. The tenants, though grateful for the improvements, weren't always the easiest to deal with. Some were late on their rent, while others were demanding more than she could afford to provide. At night, Margaret would sit at her kitchen table with her finances spread out before her, calculating bills, loans, and unexpected expenses. The numbers often seemed to blur together, and at times, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The building was costing more than she had anticipated. Between maintenance, utilities, and the loans she still had to pay off, Margaret began to feel the weight of the burden she had taken on. There were moments when doubt crept in, those dark hours when she questioned whether she was cut out for this, whether she was making a huge mistake. Her body ached from the physical labor of overseeing repairs, and her mind raced with all the things she still needed to fix, improve, and manage. It seemed like the to-do list never ended. But even in those moments of uncertainty, Margaret found herself unable to quit. Something within her had shifted since she first decided to take on the building. She wasn't the same woman who had been labeled a freeloader and dismissed by her family. She wasn't the same woman who had spent years living for others. She was a woman who had taken a step into the unknown, and she couldn't go back. She reached out to contractors for help with the bigger repairs, negotiating prices, and ensuring that the work was done properly. While the repairs were costly, Margaret knew it was necessary to ensure the building would generate income and, in turn, secure her future. She was learning to make tough decisions, and with each hurdle, she grew more resilient. But It wasn't just the physical work that took its toll. Managing the relationships with her tenants proved to be just as challenging. Some of them were difficult, constantly complaining about minor issues or requesting things that were beyond her capacity to provide. Others were struggling financially, and Margaret found herself in the uncomfortable position of needing to enforce rent payments while still feeling empathy for their situations. There was one tenant in particular, a single mother named Diane, who had trouble keeping up with the rent. Margaret had always prided herself on being compassionate, but as much as she wanted to help, she had to face the reality of her own financial limitations. She knew she couldn't afford to let anyone slide indefinitely, but asking Diane to pay her rent was always hard. One afternoon, as Margaret met with Diane in the hallway, Diane explained how she had been struggling to make ends meet after losing her job. "I just need a little more time," Diane pleaded, her voice tight with worry. Margaret understood her situation, but the pressure of her own mounting bills left her no room for leniency. "I really want to help," Margaret said, her voice soft. "But I also have bills to pay and I'm stretched thin as it is. I can offer you a payment plan, but I can't let it go for too long." The conversation was uncomfortable, but Margaret knew it was necessary. She had to start making decisions that would allow her to continue running the property, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty for putting herself first. She couldn't afford to continue giving without receiving. In setting these boundaries with her tenants, Margaret learned a hard lesson. Running a business meant making tough, sometimes heart-wrenching decisions. Despite the difficulties, Margaret remained determined. She found herself becoming more and more skilled at managing the day-to-day tasks of the building. She learned how to negotiate with vendors, handle repairs more efficiently, and even put aside money for future emergencies. Slowly but surely, the building began to show signs of improvement. The tenants appreciated the upgrades, and some even began to stay longer, which was a good sign for her long-term success. But the road wasn't easy. As Margaret continued to navigate the demands of ownership, she began to feel a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons she was learning. She wasn't just managing a building, she was managing her life. The struggles of ownership had taught her about resilience, problem-solving, and most importantly, self-reliance. The emotional and physical tolls were real, but Margaret had learned how to stay focused, how to push through the toughest days, and how to keep her eyes on the bigger picture. She wasn't just building a property, she was building a future that was entirely in her control. The path wasn't going to get any easier, but Margaret had come too far to turn back now. With each day that passed, she grew stronger, more capable, and more confident in her ability to overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. And as she worked tirelessly to turn the building into something of value, she realized that the true reward wasn't just the property, it was the woman she was becoming in the process. As the months passed, the reality of property ownership slowly began to feel less daunting. The initial struggles were still fresh in Margaret's mind, but she had learned to navigate the complexities of managing her building. The repairs were mostly done, and the tenants had settled into a rhythm. There were still challenges, of course, but Margaret had adapted. Her financial situation, which once seemed so precarious, had started to stabilize. Rent payments came in more consistently, and the building, though still a work in progress, was slowly becoming a source of income. Margaret found herself more comfortable with her role as a landlord. For the first time in her life, she was in control of her finances, not dependent on anyone else, not relying on a paycheck that barely covered her expenses. She had created something that was hers, something that would provide for her future. At first, the idea of managing money on her own felt overwhelming. There had been months when the bills seemed to pile up faster than she could pay them. There were times when Margaret thought she would drown in debt. But as she learned more about property management, she became better at budgeting. She realized that owning a property wasn't just about collecting rent. It was about managing cash flow, planning for future repairs, and saving for the unexpected. One day, after making her monthly payment toward the loan, Margaret looked at her bank statement and realized something incredible. She had enough money left over to put aside for savings. Not just a few dollars here and there, but a solid amount. She had never imagined that this would be possible. It wasn't just about the money. though it was the sense of accomplishment that came with it. Margaret had always felt like she was living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet, often relying on others for help. But now, she had the financial freedom to make her own choices. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her sense of security grew with each passing month. As she continued to build her savings, Margaret found herself thinking about the future. What could she do next? She had already achieved so much, had turned a rundown building into something stable, but there was still more she could do. The idea of expanding her property portfolio began to take root. She started researching more buildings, looking for opportunities to invest. While the thought of taking on more projects seemed daunting, Margaret knew she had the skills and knowledge to make it work. The income from her current property was steady, and she was becoming increasingly confident in her ability to handle multiple properties. But more than that, the idea of financial independence filled Margaret with a sense of pride she had never known before. She was no longer at the mercy of others, no longer dependent on family or friends for support. She had built something of value, something that gave her the power to make decisions for herself. This was the empowerment she had been craving all along. One evening, as Margaret sat on her front porch, watching the sunset and reflecting on how far she had come, she realized that the journey wasn't just about financial success. It was about reclaiming her personal power. The building had given her more than just money. It had given her confidence, independence, and the ability to take control of her future. She had faced the challenges head-on and had come out on top. She had learned how to manage her finances, how to set boundaries, how to make decisions that were best for her. And through it all, she had rediscovered the woman she had once been, the woman who had dreams, ambitions, and the drive to make them come true. The thought of what lay ahead no longer seemed as daunting. She had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving her goals, no matter how big they seemed. With her financial situation becoming more secure and her confidence growing, Margaret realized that she wasn't just creating a life for herself, she was building a legacy. The freedom that came with financial independence was priceless. It wasn't just about the ability to spend money. It was the ability to make choices, to have control over her own life, to invest in her future without fear or uncertainty. Margaret had taken control of her financial destiny, and that was the greatest gift she could give herself. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly free. She wasn't just the woman who had been overlooked and dismissed. She was a woman who had taken control of her life, who had built something real, something lasting. And as she sat on her porch that evening, with the quiet of the night settling in around her, Margaret smiled, knowing that the best was yet to come. With each passing day, Margaret's confidence grew. As she took ownership of the building and her financial future, she realized something powerful. Her worth was not defined by how much she gave to others, nor by the role she had played as a mother and wife. She had spent so much of her life pouring everything into her family, sacrificing her dreams and her own happiness. But now, as she stood on the cusp of a new life, one where she was in control, independent, and strong, she began to understand that her value wasn't tied to her selflessness. Her worth was intrinsic, and it was hers to define. At first, this realization was unsettling. Margaret had always been the caretaker, the one who sacrificed her time, energy, and resources for everyone else. She had never asked for anything in return. She had been content in her role, believing that love and duty were enough. But now, as she took a step back, she saw how much of her own life she had neglected. She had given so much of herself that she had forgotten to invest in her own well-being, her own growth, and her own happiness. One evening, as Margaret sat at her desk, reviewing the building's finances, she paused and looked around at the small, but growing, success she had created. The apartment complex was no longer a dilapidated building. It had become a place of stability, a source of pride. As she thought about the journey that had brought her here, Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for her success, but for herself. She had made it happen. She had transformed her life. But it wasn't just the financial success that mattered. It was the way she now saw herself. The woman who had once felt invisible, unappreciated, and overlooked had found her voice. The woman who had been labeled a freeloader was now the woman who owned property, managed her finances, and took control of her own future. Margaret was no longer the woman who had been defined by her role as a caretaker. She was Margaret, the woman who was reclaiming her life, who was rediscovering her passions, and who was learning to love herself again. Margaret had spent so many years giving that she had forgotten to ask herself what she wanted, what she needed, and what made her happy. But now, with every step forward, she was rediscovering her own desires. She began to take small moments for herself, whether it was enjoying a quiet afternoon with a book, taking a walk in the park, or simply sitting in her garden, enjoying the peace. These small acts of self-care were a declaration of self-worth. They were a reminder that Margaret, too, deserved time, attention, and love. Her relationships with her children, though still complicated, began to shift. The more Margaret respected her own boundaries and cared for herself, the more her children began to respect her. They saw her as a woman who was strong, independent, and capable, not just as their mother, but as an individual in her own right. They began to understand that her worth was not tied to what she could give them. She was not their servant, she was their equal. One afternoon, her son called. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but sincere, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing lately, and I just want to say, I'm proud of you. You've really changed. I can see how much you've grown, and it's inspiring." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. For so long, she had sought validation from her family, desperately trying to earn their approval. But now, for the first time, she realized that she didn't need their approval to feel validated. She had already proven her worth to herself. As her children began to see the changes in her, they started to support her in ways they never had before. They respected her independence, and though they still called on her for help, they no longer took her for granted. They began to understand that their mother was a woman in her own right, with her own life, goals, and dreams. She was not just the person who served them. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. Margaret's journey to self-worth was not an easy one. It had required vulnerability, courage, and a willingness to face her fears. But through it all, she had discovered something profound. True worth comes from within. It comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and having the courage to live your life on your own terms. And as Margaret sat on her porch one evening, reflecting on how far she had come, she realized that her journey was far from over. She had taken control of her financial future, but now she was focused on her emotional and personal growth. She was learning to live for herself, to honor her own needs, and to value herself as much as she had always valued others. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but Margaret knew she was ready. She was no longer the woman who had been labeled a freeloader. She was the woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up, who had found her worth and her voice. And with that newfound strength, Margaret knew there was nothing she couldn't accomplish. Margaret's transformation wasn't just about reclaiming her financial independence or setting boundaries. It was also about repairing the fractured relationships she had with her children. For years, she had been the silent giver, the one who poured everything into her family, only to feel overlooked and unappreciated. The sting of being dismissed as a freeloader had cut deep, but it was also the catalyst for the change that had reshaped her life. As Margaret continued to grow in her confidence and sense of self-worth, her relationship with her children slowly began to change. At first, it wasn't easy. Her children had grown accustomed to her being a certain way, and they didn't fully understand why their mother was suddenly acting differently. But Margaret had learned that the most important relationship she needed to nurture was the one she had with herself. Her children, especially her son, had always relied on her for support, emotional, financial, and physical. But now, as Margaret began to take control of her own life, she could see the shift in their attitudes. They were beginning to notice her changes, and it wasn't always comfortable for them. They had grown used to the idea of their mother always being available, always putting their needs first. One day, her daughter reached out to her. "Mom," she said, her voice tentative but soft, "I've been thinking. I know I haven't been there for you the way I should have been, and I'm sorry. You've always given so much to everyone else. but now I see how much you've been holding back. You've changed, and I want to be part of that." Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For so long, she had waited for acknowledgement, for her children to recognize her sacrifices. But hearing these words, hearing her daughter recognize the changes Margaret had made in her own life, was a moment of healing. It wasn't just an apology, it was an acknowledgement of Margaret's strength, her growth, and her right to live for herself. From that moment on, things began to shift. Her children started to support her decisions, even when they didn't fully understand them. They respected her boundaries, and slowly, they began to see her not just as their mother, but as a woman who had fought to regain her own identity. Her son, who had been particularly distant, reached out to her one afternoon. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the way things used to be and the way things are now. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You've always done so much for everyone else, but now I see how much you're doing for yourself. It's inspiring." Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. She had never expected her children to completely understand her journey, but hearing their words of support meant the world. The healing process was slow, but it was happening. She no longer felt like a background character in their lives. She was no longer defined solely by her role as a mother or caretaker. She was Margaret, an individual, a woman with her own dreams and aspirations. Over time, the dynamic between Margaret and her children grew more balanced. They began to see her not just as someone to lean on, but as someone to admire. Margaret had always been there for them, but now they were learning to be there for her. They saw how hard she had worked to rebuild her life, and it was impossible not to respect her for it. There were still moments of tension, of course. Change is never easy, and Margaret's children had their own struggles to work through. But what mattered most was the shift in perspective. Margaret was no longer the woman who had lost herself in the role of caretaker. She was a woman who had found herself again, and that realization began to bring her closer to her children in ways she hadn't imagined. One evening, as they sat together around the dinner table, Margaret looked at her family. Her children, once distant and confused by her new boundaries, were now engaged, listening to her, offering their support. They were no longer taking her for granted. They were starting to understand the importance of respecting each other's individuality. Margaret smiled to herself, feeling a warmth in her heart that had been missing for so long. The road to reconnection had been long, but it was worth every step. She had taken control of her own life, set boundaries, and found self-worth. And now, her relationship with her children was beginning to reflect that change. As she looked around the table at her family, Margaret realized that her journey wasn't just about creating a financial future for herself or reclaiming her independence. It was about showing her children what it meant to live authentically, to put oneself first, and to never give up on the possibility of growth and change. She had set an example, not just through her actions, but through the quiet strength she had cultivated within herself. The future was still uncertain, and there would be more challenges ahead. But Margaret knew that with the support of her children, her newfound sense of self-worth, and the lessons she had learned along the way, there was nothing she couldn't face. Reconnecting with her children was just another step on her journey, and it was one that brought her closer to the life she had always dreamed of. A life of purpose, independence, and love. For years, Margaret had given so much of herself to others. She had been the caregiver, the mother, the wife, always putting the needs of others before her own. But now, as she stood on the other side of her transformation, she realized something vital. In order to truly live a fulfilled life, she had to learn to care for herself, too. Self-care had always been a foreign concept to Margaret. It wasn't that she didn't want to take care of herself. It was that she had never seen it as a priority. She had always believed that taking care of others was her primary role, and she had felt guilty every time she took time for herself. But after the changes she had made, taking control of her finances, setting boundaries, and reclaiming her life, Margaret knew that she couldn't continue living that way. In order to keep giving, she needed to replenish herself. At first, the idea of self-care felt almost indulgent. She had spent her whole life running on fumes, never giving herself a break. But as she began to incorporate small acts of self-care into her routine, she noticed a profound shift. It wasn't just about treating herself to a day at the spa or a weekend getaway. It was about learning to prioritize her own well-being, both physically and emotionally. Margaret started with the basics, getting more sleep, eating healthier, and making time for exercise. She joined a local yoga class, something she had always wanted to try but had never found the time for. At first, it felt awkward. She wasn't used to taking time for herself, and she certainly wasn't used to slowing down. But as she began to stretch and breathe, something shifted within her. It was as if she was reconnecting with a part of herself that had been buried under years of sacrifice and neglect. In addition to physical self-care, Margaret also made time for activities that brought her joy. She started reading again, something she hadn't done in years. She joined a local book club and began to enjoy the simple pleasure of getting lost in a good story. These small acts of self-care began to accumulate, and soon Margaret found herself feeling more energized, more present, and more connected to her own desires. But self-care wasn't just about physical health or hobbies. It was also about emotional well-being. Margaret had spent so many years suppressing her own needs and emotions in favor of others that she had forgotten how to express herself. She had forgotten how to voice her own desires, to set aside time to process her feelings, or to simply rest without guilt. One afternoon, while sitting in her cozy living room with a cup of tea, Margaret thought about all the years she had spent running on autopilot, constantly doing for others and never stopping to ask herself what she truly needed. She realized that she had been afraid of her own emotions, afraid that if she took the time to really feel, it would be too overwhelming. But now, as she embraced self-care, she found that giving herself permission to feel wasn't a burden. It was freeing. She began to write in a journal each day, reflecting on her thoughts and emotions. Sometimes it was a simple list of things she was grateful for. Other times, it was a letter to herself, expressing her hopes and dreams for the future. This practice of journaling became a safe space for Margaret, a way to process her emotions and reconnect with her true self. Margaret also made a conscious decision to let go of any guilt that came with her new routine. For so long, she had felt like she wasn't doing enough, like if she wasn't constantly giving, she wasn't fulfilling her role as a mother or a woman. But now, she understood that taking time for herself didn't mean she was neglecting others. In fact, it meant she could show up better for those around her. When she took care of her own needs, she had more energy, patience, and love to offer. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself feeling lighter, more balanced. She was still working hard on the building, still managing her finances, still caring for her family. But now, she wasn't doing it at the expense of her own well-being. Self-care had become a regular part of her life, and it was allowing her to be more present, more focused, and more content. Her relationship with her children also improved as she began to take care of herself. They saw her prioritizing her own well-being, and it inspired them to do the same. Her son, who had always been busy with his own family, started calling her more often, asking how she was doing, and even encouraging her to take breaks when she seemed overwhelmed. Her daughter, who had once been hesitant to accept Margaret's changes, began to see how much healthier and happier her mother was. One evening, as they sat together for dinner, Margaret's daughter looked across the table at her with a soft smile. "Mom, I have to say, I've noticed a difference in you. You seem different, happier, and I think you're setting such a good example for me. I'm proud of you." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just the words, it was the recognition of her growth. For years, she had been so focused on giving to others that she had neglected the most important person in her life, herself. But now, as she looked at her children, she realized that by taking care of herself, she was teaching them the most important lesson of all, that self-care isn't selfish. It's necessary. As Margaret sat back and took a deep breath, she realized that the woman she had become was not defined by the role she had played for others, but by the love and care she gave herself. For the first time in her life, she understood that true strength came from within, and it was from this place of self-love and care that she could truly give to others without burning out. Self-care had become her foundation. It had given her the strength to pursue her goals, the energy to face challenges, and the peace to enjoy the simple moments in life. Margaret was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. And as she looked ahead, she knew that the best was yet to come. As the months turned into years, Margaret's journey of transformation was far from over. She had faced countless obstacles, financial struggles, personal doubts, and strained relationships. Yet, with each challenge, she grew stronger. The woman who had once been labeled a freeloader, dismissed by her own family, was now a beacon of strength, resilience, and empowerment. She had reclaimed her life, her independence, and her worth. And with each step she took, she not only reshaped her own future, but also left an imprint on those around her. Her building had flourished. What had once been a rundown structure was now a thriving, well-maintained property. The income from the building was steady, and Margaret had even expanded her investments, purchasing a second property. With her financial independence firmly established, Margaret had gained control of her destiny in ways she had never thought possible. She was no longer at the mercy of others' expectations. She had created a future that was truly hers. But it wasn't just about the money or the properties. It was about the legacy she was building. Margaret knew that her journey had been about more than just overcoming financial hardship or building wealth. It had been about self-discovery, about finding her own voice, and about teaching herself and others the importance of setting boundaries, of self-care, and of embracing personal growth. Her legacy wasn't just in the buildings she owned or the money she had earned. It was in the lessons she had learned and the example she had set. Margaret's relationship with her children, once strained and distant, had blossomed into something beautiful. They had seen her strength, her perseverance, and her ability to rise above adversity. And as they saw her thriving, not just financially, but emotionally and mentally, they began to understand the most important lesson she had to offer, that true fulfillment doesn't come from giving endlessly to others, but from giving to yourself first. She had taught them that living authentically, setting boundaries, and prioritizing self-care were the keys to leading a happy, successful life. One evening, Margaret sat with her son and daughter, who had both become more involved in her life since her transformation. They were having dinner together, just the three of them, in her cozy dining room. It felt like a milestone for Margaret, a moment of reflection, of looking back at everything she had been through and everything she had achieved. "Mom," her son said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about you lately. And I just want to say, I'm so proud of what you've done. Not just with the building, but with yourself. You've changed in ways that I never expected, and it's honestly inspiring." Her daughter nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's not just about the money or the building. It's about the strength you've shown and how you've built something so much bigger than just a property. You've built a life for yourself, one that's filled with purpose. That's something we all need to learn from." Margaret felt her heart swell with emotion. This was the moment she had dreamed of, a moment when her children truly saw her for who she was, not just as their mother, but as the woman she had become. She wasn't just a caregiver, a selfless figure in the background. She was a woman who had fought to create a life of purpose, a life that she could be proud of. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, I couldn't have done it without the decision to choose myself, to take the reins of my own life, to stand up for my worth. It wasn't always easy, but I'm glad I did. And I'm glad I did it for me." Her children exchanged a look, and Margaret could see the pride in their eyes. They had always known her as the one who gave everything for them. But now, they were seeing a different side of her, a woman who had learned that her happiness and fulfillment were just as important as theirs. As the evening wore on, Margaret realized something. She had not only transformed her own life, but she had also created a ripple effect in her family. Her children were learning to prioritize their own needs, to set boundaries, and to live with intention. The lessons she had learned, sometimes the hard way, were now being passed down, becoming a part of their own journeys. Margaret's legacy wasn't just about financial success. It was about showing her children and anyone who had watched her journey that change was possible at any age, that it was never too late to take control, to prioritize yourself, and to build the life you deserve. Her journey had come full circle. She had taken the leap of faith, and it had led her to a life that was not only financially stable, but also rich with meaning, connection, and purpose. She had rediscovered herself, reclaimed her worth, and created a future that was uniquely her own. And as Margaret looked around the table at her family, she knew that her story was just the beginning. She had built something lasting, not just a successful business, but a legacy of empowerment, self-respect, and love. A legacy that would live on long after she was gone. This was her legacy. This was the life she had fought for. And it was one she could proudly pass on to those who mattered most.